All right, welcome back to the Surfcast Podcast. Make sure you're following along. Make sure you're subscribed. Make sure you are keeping up to date when all of our episodes come out. We just had a special episode come out, and if you're not following along on social and the other places, you might miss stuff like that. So, anyways, that's the intro, which you may never hear, because we're going to try something new today, Toby.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't work, no one's ever going to hear this. But if you're hearing this right now, it worked. So spoiler alert, it worked.
Or at least we think it worked.
Okay. So today's topic is going to be a little bit, it's sort of in the vein of the surf associations, but not really. It's more me wanting to ask Toby a question about fishing. Almost like a mini interview, I guess, is sort of another way to think about it. And I was thinking about this question based on one of our last episodes where we were talking about the tabletop bars, and I was saying that a mistake that so many anglers make, and frankly, they're not the ones that are going to be listening to the Surfcast podcast. They're the ones who need to read articles and listen to the podcast, because I think most of you listening to this probably wouldn't do this. But anyways, something that a lot of anglers do is they cast a lure out and they retrieve it straight back. They don't do anything different. They just throw it out there and they reel it back. Now, I'll even count this as fishing, for example, a little neck popper, which I see on South County, Rhode Island in the fall, which is about the only time I actually see people. But South County, Rhode Island, the little neck popper, to throw it out, and it's the dunk, tunk, 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 absolutely same thing every single time. That also counts to me as a straight retrieve. So most anglers with most plugs, 99% of the time, I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe based on what I've experienced, they cast out, they reel it straight back. And I was thinking about this, Toby, and I don't actually know your answer, but is there times that you cast your lure out and reel it straight back? What are they, if you do that at all? I'm assuming you do, but I don't actually know the answer, and that's what got me to this point. So hopefully this episode works, because you don't know what I was going to ask you. So.
Yeah. Hopefully I don't just have a bang, bang answer, done.
Yeah.
Because, I didn't know what was coming on this one. You said you had an idea, something we were going to run with, see what happens. So, all right. So you're straight out asking if there's a time in surf when I do that, which do that straight retrieve with no augmentation, addition, nothing. It's just cast, engage, and reel it straight back.
Yes.
I'd have to say, and I hesitate to ever say there's absolutes in anything.
Okay, this is already going different than I thought. Okay.
But absolutely never happens. I can't think of a single scenario whatsoever where my retrieve, from the moment it splashes down and I come tight. So I'm not even, sometimes I'll, jerk it to get tight with a darter, for instance, or even a bomber, you'll catch it. From that point to the point that I lift it out of the water, I cannot think of a situation, scenario, anything where I'm retrieving an artificial lure and I'm not at some point through the retrieve adding something extra to it, where I'm not just cranking at a monotonous rate, steady all the way through. I'm trying to go through. I'm like, this lure, no, you do it for this. This lure, you do it for that. That scenario, this. There's always a little piece of something that's happening.
Never.
The closest, and I almost said, okay, there's one scenario.
Okay.
Because I was trying to go through, as I was multitasking lures and things, and what I was thinking, which comes the closest, is when I'm dead drifting across a current. Okay. For instance, whether it's like a lot of the times I'm doing this in spring runs on the rivers when I'm fishing, whether it's like a 9-inch sluggo or a redfin plastic swimmer or something like that. A lot of the presentations, you cast it to where you come tight, and then you sweep it through your target zone where you think the fish are sitting. And a lot of times, and for a long time, I did just come tight and hold. And the more I would fish sluggos in that scenario, I would miss the hits. And as hard as the sluggos would hit, because I would almost not be paying attention. So what I then started to do was I always would have my hand on my right hand's holding the rod, my left hand is holding the reel handle, and I will do the slowest crank to sort of continue to keep it tight.
Right.
But to really keep me focused, I will take my right hand, my rod hand, and ever so slightly pulse and pop. So I'm kind of like, I'm actively in two ways. I'm manipulating it just a little bit, but I'm staying in touch. And what that then makes me do is add in a larger pop every once in a while. And for the most part, I kind of don't want that extra addition to the swim, because I've watched the herring in the spring on the river. What I'm trying to replicate is a herring that is trying to go upstream against the current. And what they'll do is they'll find a resting pocket, and they'll kind of like chill there, and then they have to blast to their next resting pocket and their next, and it's never, a straight line up. So what I'd see a lot of times is they'd cut across, almost like turn their head and just angle across, and they're barely beating their tail. So that's what I'm trying to kind of replicate with that cross the current down and across presentation. But even when they're doing that, they will dunk, and they'll do a jump every so often. So that's why I didn't mind so much adding it in and developed that into it. And that was probably the last type of scenario before I added that throbbing and slow crank, where I would just cast and hold it tight, which is as close as I can come up with for a straight retrieve.
Well, hold on. Time out. So you just told me something fairly profound. I didn't think you were going to say never. I thought you'd be like, well, most of the time I do this, but there's these times, blah, 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 blah. So let me ask you, let's go back, actually. Let me ask you a very simple question. Why never? Why are you constantly manipulating your lure?
So that's for...
Or put it this way. Let me put it this way.
Yeah.
Why aren't you letting the lure do the work for you?
Because I've spent a lot of time either on purpose or, for instance, when I'm looking for bunker, I spend a lot of time watching them. Whatever the bait fish is, sand eels, not as much, going to run into them, but when I've seen them, or silver sides, or herring, or shad, whatever the bait species, I always make a point to watch them. Whether I'm trying to collect them for bait, I see them come by, they're just chilling out in the wash. So I've tried to observe them, and they're never it's never like a consistent, defined pattern to their movement. There's nothing that you can say that I can perceive where it's 3 tail beats to the right and 2 to the left and then a shot. It's always a randomness to their movement. So if take something as simple as a plastic lip swimmer, an SP minnow. If you put an SP minnow, you tie it to a line and put it in the current, and it's just sitting there, it's a very methodical, straight, repetitive motion.
That's right.
And it's not natural from what I've observed of the prey species. So in the very least, even if I'm taking that SP minnow for the example, because everybody can envision what that thing looks like beaten through the water, you need to, in my opinion, add a little something to make it look natural, because I'm not saying striped bass like, well, that thing isn't doing an erratic swim, so it must not be natural. I'm not going to hit it. But I think they're just so used to seeing that. That's what they're expecting. And
that's right.
The additional little piece to it is a lot of times I have found that little additional motion triggers the bite.
That's
Whether
right.
it triggers the bite on the escape, I call it, so while you're pulling and they hit it, or it escapes, stops, and almost is resting and looks vulnerable, and that's when they hit it. Like, so many, I mean, I hate to put a number on it, but I know the vast majority of my hits come just as I pull it or just after I stop, regardless of whether I'm throwing a sluggo, a bucktail jig, a darter, a bottle, anything. You come up with a lure that I'm throwing, that's when that hit comes. So that's the other piece of why I'm adding that in. That it's that little trigger of some sort to get the fish to commit.
That's right. And this is something that you and I agree very, very strongly on, both of us, because I believe as well that you said it's very consistent. The SPA, mechanical is the word I use. Biology is not mechanical. Biology is random, and biology is not steady. So I'm talking about baitfish biology. There's nothing that they do exactly the same over and over and over and over. And fish key on what is natural. And if you present them with something that does exactly the same thing over and over and over and over, they are going to go, something's wrong, something's different, they're not thinking about it. You're not playing on their natural behaviors, their instincts. And their instincts are going to be, something is strange, this isn't normal, I'm not going to hit. Now, there's lots of people listening and say, yeah, but there was this time I was reeling in the Espumino Strait and we were going real slow with it and I was catching fish. Yes, we have examples of that, I'm sure, too. But for the most part, and again, somebody's going to be like, yeah, but I had a 42-pounder. Yes, okay, I know. There's one guy out there. But for the most part, the smaller the fish, the more you can get away with that. The larger the fish, the less you can get away with it. Because randomness is life. Life and the way it moves through the water is random. Because it's constantly dealing with all of these three-dimensional interactions. So I agree with you 100% in that regard, where your inputs have to create something lifelike, and you can't solely rely on the natural movement of your lure. Now, this is totally random because I didn't have a completely thought-out script for this in terms of what I wanted to ask, but you've already said it, so I want to ask. Even when you're swinging a bucktail, you're not doing a straight retrieve.
Yeah, so that was the other little piece that started to work in when I was first learning to fish a bucktail. It was in outflows, not in the open surf side, and I even do this now that I fish them in the open surf. But when I was fishing inlets, outflows, jetties, breachways, whatever you want to call them in your region, I would cast out and I would move them a lot. I felt that a bucktail with a pork rind needed a lot of extra movement, and you're making it dart and move and jump and all around, because at that point in my evolution of my understanding of what was going on and how to fish the surf, there's no swimming plate, no wobble plate, no dive plane on the jig to make it look alive. So I thought that I need to put all of the action into it. I thought every bit of the action was coming from me. So then I was like moving that thing like crazy. And at the time, some of the old timers that I was learning from, fortunately for me, took the time to say, dude, slow down. I'm sure one of them grabbed my rod at one point and was like, don't effing move it, just reel. And okay, that worked, because if you look at, in that case, the bucktail jig with a pork rind, or if you're putting even a curly tail or a fat cow strip or whatever you're putting on it, when that does just come through the water, it does just enough bit of a ripple to simulate life of some sort.
Right.
But I still like to add that little dart jump motion, and especially I'm looking at it too. When I'm jigging in a breachway, when it's coming along, I'll cast out, find bottom, and I crank, and I do a slow, and I'll add it, and it's sort of like that reference I made before of watching the river herring working against the current. I've seen in the breachways during the day, because I've stood on the shallow Rhode Island breachways in the middle of the day at low tide with polarized glasses on and a sandy bottom, and I've watched scup. And they'll like chill in a spot, and then they'll jump and they'll dart around. So I'm again trying to replicate something that I've seen a forage species do. So I mean, I'm not putting a bucktail, and I'm not the old extreme of motion the whole time. I'm closer to the end of the spectrum of not adding much, but I will every couple of cranks. I get in my head sometimes to remember to do stuff by counting. I've said it before, like I count when I'm chunking.
Yeah, you're a big counter, right?
Yeah, when I'm fishing, when I was fishing a rig deal, when we could still use J hooks on them, the primary retrieve for me for the rig deal was 5 rotations of the handle and 1 pop, 5 rotations a pop. Then it was 3 in 1, so it's 5-1, 5-1, 3-1, and I know nothing in nature is moving at that consistent of a repetition, but it kept me watching and paying attention to what was going on. And the other way I validated it, that I'm still doing something consistent and repetitive. 5 cranks, it's moved so far that likely that fish didn't follow it that time to start to, and again, putting way more intelligence in this creature than it it has, but it's not following it long enough to see, oh, well, no, it moved 5, then it moved 3, then 5, then 5. Like, they're not seeing it long enough. They're, I'm assuming, only seeing the little window around the move, that little extra piece. And the same with the jigs. I a lot of times will get in a consistent where it's a couple of cranks. Usually it's like, it's on the lower. I don't have a set number with it. Like it's, 3 or 4. Or the moment I touch bottom. If I'm swinging, if I stop the retrieve and I crank it a little bit and then I've stopped and it hits bottom, I give it a pop for 2 reasons. One, sometimes what I thought was bottom was a hit because
okay.
That's one of the biggest things I learned from 3-weighing bucktail jigs on boats is you set the hook on everything because you just don't know. So it was A, in case that what I thought was a bottom was actually a hit, and B, it's that darting action I have now. It's like let's say it looks like a porgy or scup is swimming across. Oh, it accidentally swam in the rock and it got spooked and it jumped, and that's where the bass jumps on it. So again, it's things that I've observed the prey doing, and I'm trying in a way to replicate that. So that's where, that's really what it comes down to for that addition of moment is just trying to replicate something I've seen happen in the different scenarios I've observed.
That's right. There's so much here to talk about. I'm listening to you. This is going to be a very short version of a much longer thing I do in the seminars. But the thing that I heard you say, and I just want to reiterate it, is that, when you mentioned the herring going from the pockets, and you talked about the scup, this also applies to lobsters moving between rocks oftentimes, or spearing, jumping from one spot to the next, or needlefish. I've seen this too. The thing is, hiding for most things in the water, especially at night in the surf, hiding is not doing any movement. You can hide in plain view. It's like the T-Rex from Jurassic Park. Just don't move and it can't see you, right? Because it's making no disturbance, it's making no vibrational waves. Nothing's coming off of it. But when you do move, it's at like near 100% because you want to get to wherever you're getting to so you can stop moving again. You don't want to move sort of in between and attract attention. And so oftentimes when I'm adding motion to my plugs, it's pretty dramatic. I think that there is a lot of benefit definitely to doing some of the things I've heard other anglers talk about. Bill Wetzel, he adds a lot of motion to all of his plugs. He said this. He doesn't do anything straight. He's always like, add in motion and jerks. And I think we were talking about the darter specifically, Toby, and one time, and he mentioned on social media that he was just like you, where he was giving motion to the darter. I think that was him.
Mm-hmm. I think I remember what you're referencing. Yeah,
he's talked about flipping his line and tapping the top of the rod, all of that stuff. But I think, and I don't want to put any words in his mouth. So, Bill, if I'm wrong, you can yell at me. But he's doing a lot of more subtle motions. My motions tend to be a lot more dramatic. They tend to be really severe. And so one of the things, if you're listening to this, to think about is, even if you've been doing and adding some motion to your retrieves every once in a while, you can be pretty severe with it. Especially, some plugs are better than others. Mm-hmm. And if you're using a plastic swimmer, you can be pretty severe with a lot of them. I mean, especially something like an SP Minnow, maybe a redfin. I don't go quite as crazy, but something that's under, down a little deeper, a little more stable, you can go pretty hard on it. Mm-hmm. So again, so much to talk about, but I'm just going to ask you what's burning in my mind right now. There's one scenario. Well, hold on. I won't even ask you that. I want to tell you the one scenario that I always do straight, and I'll tell you about it afterwards. But before I do that, before we run out of time, the other plug besides the bucktail that I often hear, don't do anything. And I'll admit, when I'm swinging a bucktail, there are plenty of times where I'm not adding anything. Like you're talking about, I'm adding nothing. Mm-hmm. The other one is the needlefish. We hear so much. Cast it out. What do people say all the time? Cast it out. Go slow.
Retrieve as slow as possible.
And if you're not and whatever speed you're going, go slower. Right? That's what we hear constantly. It's like the number one refrain on SOL, for example. That's where I see it like all the time. And I don't know on there anymore, but for a long time it was like, there was like a religion around that idea. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to the needlefish, there are no, and again, we're doing 99.999%. We'll never say 100%. There's no scenarios where you just reel it straight. And if not, what are you doing? If someone want to start with a needlefish, what should they start with in terms of giving it action?
So I've described the way that I retrieve a needlefish. If you didn't know what I just cast, you knew about surf fishing, you
Sure.
might assume I'm throwing a darter.
Okay.
Because my darter and my needlefish retrieves are exactly the same. Meaning, cast it out, come tight, give it a little bit of initial pop or jerk to sort of get it to bite or really make sure I'm tight and I can feel it. And then it's a retrieve whatever speed is required to stay tight to it. So it might be slower if there's a cross current, a little bit faster if there's less current. My needlefish, I prefer to have a needlefish that swims, or I rig them to get them to swim. So that's why I'm doing that straight retrieve. But still, in the same regard, that pop, especially with a needlefish, like a darter, like a glide bait, gets it to amplify its scoop and it's bounce off to the sides. And whether I'm fishing a surface needlefish and I'm trying to get it to almost nose up out of the water, or a deep running needlefish and I'm just trying to get it to move and add something in, I'm still doing that. And I'd say I generally run that needlefish on the faster side. Like you were saying with that traditional statement of cast it out slow and then slow it down. Whenever anyone says that, and I hear someone spitting it out or referencing it, I flash back to the number of times John Habb said that to me when we were fishing together. And he would say it, but he wasn't doing it. He would say, this is how you do it. And I'd see him cast out, and then he'd go crazy, and he'd work the needlefish almost like a popper, and then he'd slow it down, and he'd had all these different retrieves. And I'm like, yeah, I called him out on it a couple of times. No, that's the primary though, is slow. I'm like, but John, you never throw it that way.
That's too funny.
You're going slow and fast and darting and this and that, and especially with his needles, the way that those sink and swim, you
got to give them some action. You got to give them some action.
And if you go slow, they're going to end up in the rocks. So maybe it was a marketing ploy to get guys to break his needles up and have to replace them. I never picked up on it until just now.
That's funny. That's too funny. Actually, this gets to what I want to say before we close out the episode, because I definitely would not say there's no scenarios where I don't retrieve it back straight. And one of the ones that I was thinking about, I feel like there's a few guys, just a couple of guys I fish with, who would probably say to me that I'm a liar if I said that I never retrieve it straight back, because there is a scenario with a couple of different plugs I do that, and that's in a moderate to what probably would be considered a heavy surf, but I don't actually consider it to be heavy surf. Call it a moderate surf. Wind in my face, 3, 4, 5 foot waves on a beach. And in that case, there are times where with a soft plastic, a bucktail, or a needlefish, I'm hanging the plug in the surf, and I'm actually maintaining the pressure I want on it to almost not retrieve it to me, but keep it moving up and down in the water column. So I'm envisioning something swimming through the surf straight at the beach, or maybe to the side, sort of at an angle. And by just reeling it straight and keeping the pressure on the line, I'm having that thing move up and down naturally in the water the way it would if it was something alive like a squid or a minnow or even a sand eel, and keeping that thing kind of sort of going up and down. And the pull of the wave and the randomness of the breaking of the waves and the rolling of the waves is giving that thing all kinds of back and forth swimming motion. If you're watching the video, I'm making all kinds of weird motions with my hand. But so you're getting this up and down motion, and the randomness of the water, because it's so turbulent in those situations. It's not like a rip or a current line where you're getting this, sort of planar, singular movement of water. You're getting all this randomness. It's making that thing look super weird as it's moving through the water. And in those cases where it can sometimes be hard to keep a handle on it, I don't want to be introducing any jerks or twitches or anything like that. So when I was thinking about asking you this, I was thinking back to, this is the one case where I can definitively say, yes, I cast it out and I reel it back straight. Now, with the huge caveat, and this is the final thing I'll ask you, we'll end on this. I'm speeding up and slowing down, though. I am absolutely changing the speed. So there's times where I'm barely reeling and other times where I'm never going fast, but I'm reeling, much more quickly. So does that count? Because I'm still not really reeling it, straight. So does that count, Toby?
I would say so, because I'm thinking of it similarly to like a surface Danny. A lot of guys in that case, I've seen, assuming they're doing a pretty steady retrieve on that as well, to just keep that constant steady V wake. And I'll do that a lot, but I'll add that extra pop with those. But with that, sometimes a full pop is too much.
Yes.
So that it totally throws it off. You might flip it, roll it. So in that case, it might just be a hard, quick crank. And that's what gets it to do it. So similar to what you're saying, I still think I would still put that in the case of not a straight retrieve, because you're not attempting to maintain the very same speed from start of retrieve to end of retrieve. You know, if you're changing that speed, whether through motion with the rod, motion with the reel, the rod tip, your body, sometimes it could just be stepping away as well from it to give it that. Yeah, if you're adding anything other than essentially a robotic program, steady retrieve at this, do not do anything different, then I put it in there as, you're changing it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's interesting to know. So again, the listeners are learning as I'm learning, because I didn't know what you were going to say, and I just wanted to ask you. And I said, we talk on the phone so much. I was like, why wait to ask him on the phone? Why don't we save it for the podcast? So we learned this. Now, hopefully this helps you catch more fish. But the other thing it should make you think is, every second that you're out there in the surf, you should be thinking about what you're doing. There's no checking out. There's no fading away. You're engaged in what you're doing and what your lure's doing, and staying in touch with it. Toby's counting, whatever it takes for you to do to keep engaged and focused. I think that's also what's come out of this for me as well. Of course, I do that already, but it was sort of a great reminder, this whole episode, that you're never just out there zoned out. It's nice to escape to fishing, but if you really want to be productive, you should be really engaged. And adding that extra bit to the lure is staying engaged. Right, Toby?
Absolutely.
Yeah. This has been a weekly edition of the Surfcast Podcast. You can find out more about the podcast at surfcastpodcast.com, or definitely check us out on social media, Facebook, Instagram, at the Surfcast Podcast.